Saturday and on such a late, short notice. So today we have a press conference here about a former captive American in Syria who is filing a lawsuit against the Qatar Islamic Bank. We have the pleasure to host Mr. Matt Schrier, photojournalist captured and tortured in Syria, and he will tell us a bit more about his story, what happened, and what's the case now and what is new in this case. So, Mr. Schrier, you have the floor.
Thank you. As many people know, I was abducted by the al-Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda in Syria, and when people usually think of these terrorist organizations, they imagine big bearded bad guys with AK-47s and suicide belts. They rarely think of how much money it takes to finance these organizations, and it takes a lot. These terrorist armies don't just need money for weapons. They need food, they need clothes, they need medical supplies, they need petrol. They have to pay their fighters. And you're talking about millions of dollars, and they can't function in a legitimate capacity without help, especially from legitimate financial institutions that help facilitate the flow of these funds. Now, just to give you an example of my personal experience, how large the al-Nusra Front was when I was being held, and how much money it took to keep this organization going, I'll tell a little story of something I observed. One of my cells was across the hall from the kitchen. And one day when I was going to the bathroom, I noticed across the hall a stack of eggs from the counter, which was about waist high, all the way up to the ceiling, which was about 15 feet high. Each stack had 24 eggs. You're talking about easily 1,000 eggs. They were gone within a few days. Every time the door opened, there were less and less eggs. That's how many mouths were being fed at this one base alone. So you can imagine how much money it took to feed the entire army throughout the country. So it's a huge endeavor. From what I experienced, ideology is really the heart of jihad, but the lifeblood, what keeps the heart pumping, is money. And the lawsuit that I recently filed against Qatar Islamic Bank alleges that they provided financial services to make sure that these terrorist organizations, two that had me captive, the al-Nusra Front and Ahad al-Sham, had a steady influx of money coming. They did this in a variety of ways. One way was they donated 500,000 rial to Qatar Charity, as well as giving it 8 bank accounts at their institution. Now, this charity has a long-standing history of financing terrorism, going back to 1993 when bin Laden thanked them for their contributions to his cause. On top of this, they were also a very strong public supporter of the Syrian Islamic Front, which was a coalition of rebel factions fighting together, the most prominent being Ahad al-Sham. Their commander at the time of my captivity was Abu Khalid al-Suri, who everybody knew was sent there by Ayman al-Zawahiri to act as al-Qaeda's key representative in the country. Another way that they helped, allegedly, Qatar Islamic Bank finance terrorism was they allowed a guy named Al-Kabi to set up a bank account at their institution under his minor son's name. Now, this bank account was later used to solicit large donations for the al-Nusra Front after the al-Nusra Front contacted Al-Kabi asking for his help in doing this. And he agreed, and he was very successful. He did this in a variety of ways, mostly using social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. And he did it by basically posting images like this that have the bank's name and the account number set up for people to wire money to the Madid campaign, which would then send it to al-Nusra. Now, the bank has policies and procedures in place to guarantee that this type of activity does not take place at their institution. It's their obligation to know who their clients are, to know where their funding comes from, to investigate wire transfers over 4,000 rial. As you can see from this post behind me, it takes 5,500 rial to finance one fighter. So I want to know, what planet is it not suspicious for a minor to be receiving large quantities of money from international wire transfers into their account, and then for that miner to wire the money out of the account. I was a miner for a long time. I never knew anyone who made a wire transfer or received one, especially internationally. So to assume that this was going unnoticed is really preposterous, and it's really an insult to the intelligence of anybody that is trying to be convinced so. The bank recently finally released a statement alleging that denying the allegations, which I find a little ridiculous considering there are two members of the Qatari government, high level, one of them the ambassador to France, who admitted that the Medid campaign was shut down after a year because it was known for financing terrorism. That, combined with the fact that they cut a check for 500,000 rial, kind of makes it hard to deny the allegations. It reminds me of these adorable YouTube videos we see of little kids who eat cake without permission and have chocolate smeared over their faces, and then when their parents interrogate them, they deny eating the cake. So in this analogy, Qatar is basically the little kid with cake smeared all over their face, denying that they ate any. So it is with a great legal team that I filed this complaint, and I am very confident that the justice system will see the logic of pursuing this case and giving me my day in court where we can prove everything. From that, I'd like to transition into my experience and some of the horrific and really tragic things that I was forced to endure during my captivity. As everybody is pretty much aware, I was held for 7 months by the Al Nusra Front after an 18-day shoot inside and around some of the most dangerous parts of Syria. After being abducted, I was taken here to the Aleppo Pediatric Hospital, where I was held for a prolonged period of time. At first, it wasn't that bad. I kind of connected with my captors. I was at one point thrown in a cell with 18 regime POWs, or maybe 20 at that point, who became my friends and my supporters and really accepted me despite the fact that I was there to photograph the FSA killing them. They were very understanding. However, I was transferred from that cell not too long after and locked up with another American. The two of us tried to escape one day, and we were caught within 2 hours. We were threatened, and 30 minutes later, the threats came to fruition. We heard a bunch of guys at the door doorknob turned, and we saw about 8 guys dressed head to toe in black, the very famous costume. They all seemed to have one. And one at a time, we were taken down the hall and into the boiler room. And this is where the Al Nusra Front does their dirty work. I would hear them torturing people all day sometimes without a break. Different people over and over. You just hear them screaming and begging for mercy. Whack, whack, whack. When it came my time, I was brought into the room. It was packed. There were little kids in there. There was a guy hanging from a pipe by handcuffs. And I was forced down into a sitting position with my knees bent up to my chin. From there, they take a car tire and they force it over your knees like this. And then they take a pole and they slide it over the tire and under your knees, which locks it into place. They then flip you over like this. So now you're basically handcuffed with your feet in the air, and they take a very thick cable, about as thick as a nightstick, and they whack the bottoms of your feet with it. And it's impossible to describe the pain. It's like 2 sledgehammers coming down on both sides of your feet simultaneously. I had 115 of these. They take turns hitting you. At one point halfway through, they'll stop, dump a bottle of water on your feet to make it hurt more, and then they finish you off. It was the longest 5 minutes of my life, and by the time it was done and they took this tire off of me, I couldn't even walk. I couldn't even feel my feet, so they had to pick me up and drag me back to my cell, where they placed me on the floor, took the handcuffs off, but only after someone asked me if I had heard of Guantanamo Bay. This was the beginning of our punishment, not the end. From there, we were transferred to a new prison, the Hedatan Electric Institute, which is basically, I describe in my book as the dark side of hell. This is where Al-Qaeda takes you for punishment. We were locked in a cold, dark cell for almost a month and a half. And in that time, we were barely fed, kept in the dark, 24 hours a day, beaten regularly. At one point, I was stripped down to my bare back, put up against the wall, and I was flogged with a garden hose to get a confession out of me as a CIA agent. I did not break. I took it. My cellmate had broken a long time ago, and I saw how they treated him, and I didn't want to be in that position. For example, one night the management came by and they took him out, and they didn't have a tire, so they threw a rope over a pipe and they strung him up by his feet and started whacking his feet like that right outside our cell in a hallway that would fill with echoes. It's something that I will never forget. It was the most terrifying moment of my life, and I never even got touched at that time. I just had to sit and listen to it. Other days they would blast music outside of our cell for hours and hours and hours at a time. It sounded like the speakers must have been 6 feet tall. That's how loud it was. And it was the hardest month and a half of my life. It was beyond torture. It was psychological, it was physical, it was every aspect. Finally, it ended, and we were brought back to the hospital. And a few days later, I was brought down to the boiler room again. I had my feet whacked, I was kicked in the head, and by now they were using electricity to torture some of the prisoners. We had heard it. And I knew that the guy who was interrogating me stormed out of the room and he was getting a taser. And I knew that I wasn't going to be able to last. So it had been over a month, and I decided to confess. And I did. As soon as I confessed, they brought me back down to my cell. And a few hours later, they brought me across the hall where there was a camera set up. And a masked man handed me an orange jumpsuit and made me put it on, stand in front of this camera, and confess on the record. They told us that this confession would be sent to the American Embassy in Qatar so that the Qataris can basically work out a ransom deal for us. I was not very satisfied with this. The tape was never released, but they assured us that it was delivered. Not too long after, we had a new cellmate, a Moroccan jihadi, who was too crazy even for them, so they shot him in the leg and threw him in with us. And a few weeks later, we were transferred to a new jail. It was a villa out in the country. Horrible place, second worst jail I was at. We were constantly beaten and tortured psychologically, barely fed. But the good part was I was reunited with the soldiers, so I had friends again to support me, to support. And we would pass time in a variety of ways. We made a ball, and we would play hacky sack, volleyball, with a blanket, two guys on their knees holding it. And we lived like this for about 23 days. After 23 days, we were transferred back into Aleppo, into the hands of Ahad Sham, who I mentioned earlier. And we were in the custody of an emir who was under the direct command of this guy who I mentioned before, Abu Khalid al-Suri, Al-Qaeda's representative in Syria. Here's actually a picture of him standing between bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri at the Farouk camp in Afghanistan. I met this guy one night. He came into our cell with his entourage, which was a very impressive group of high-level figures, and even shook his hand before he left, all of them. So there's no doubt in my mind that this guy specifically held me captive. Ahad Sham treated us differently than al-Nusra because we weren't their prisoners, so they never beat us, but they did beat their prisoners, who were Shabiha, and they beat them viciously, sometimes right in front of us, to the point where they looked like this when they were done. Well, to be honest, they didn't look this good. This is an understatement from what they looked like. When they took their shirts off, they were usually tortured with PVC piping and cords. And this happened right in front of us sometimes, where a guy would come in a room with a piece of PVC piping and just beat them over the shoulder and the back so many times you couldn't even keep count. And this is what it looked like on a good day. And witnessing this type of abuse, just because you don't endure it, doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect on you. Having to look at this, having to listen to it, having to watch others suffer from it, it's hard to describe. It's hard to describe. But we had our ways of, excuse me. Excuse me. We had our ways of coping. We made a chessboard. This is actually the one. My friend who survived was able to smuggle it out. And I didn't really know how to play chess, but all the soldiers did, and they taught me and beat me viciously while doing it. And we also would pray a lot, and to do so we made mesba'az. This is the one my friend gave me out of the fabric on the bottom of our shirts. This belonged to my friend Ayman, who was my best friend over there, and he never came home. After when they finally came in, they told me I was being transferred and separated from them. We sat down, and I gave him mine, and he gave me his, and I never saw him again. And this is all I have to remember him by. And from there, we were transferred to a warehouse. And this place was like a dungeon. It was like this giant basement with debris all over the place. I mean, there were giant rats like this big that would crawl on me in my sleep. They were not afraid of us. And we stayed here, I believe, for 11 days until we were transferred once again to this prison. This is the transportation building in the Shrier district of Aleppo. And after about 2 weeks of being in this basement cell, they came down and they took the Moroccan out. And the Moroccan jihadi was a big dude. He was about 6'3", 230 pounds. So he couldn't fit out the window. But they took him out, and we got confirmation later on that he was killed. And because he was no longer with us, I was able to plan an escape. One of the windows was flawed in the cell. It was a basement window, so it was up high, of course, and there were wires cemented into the foundation of the building. But once upon a time, somebody snipped these wires on one of them, and whoever repaired it didn't do a very good job. So I figured out how to take the window apart because it was welded on, but not in every position, so I could unweave it, create an opening, and escape. And that's basically how I got away. After getting through the window, I wove through the streets of Aleppo for about 35, 40 minutes to get as far away from the base as I could till I linked up with the Free Syrian Army. They took me in. It took some convincing, but they took me in. And after I formed a bond with them, they decided to help me get to the Turkish border. They bought me a brand new yellow knockoff Adidas jumpsuit, some Nikes, dressed me up the next day to look like them. And we jumped in the backseat of their Jeep Cherokee, same kind of car I got kidnapped in, believe it or not, and we headed to the Turkish border. We were very nervous about the checkpoints because there were a lot of them, but thanks to God, we cruised through every single checkpoint right up to the Turkish border. I got out, and one of the humanitarians, my friend Ahmed, he went up to the Turkish guard, explained what happened. They took one look at me, saw my beard, and just a look in my eyes, and they knew that he was telling the truth. And the Turks let me cross and brought me to a police station. And a few hours later, I called the embassy. They sent somebody, and from there, it was just Gaziantep to Istanbul, Istanbul to New York, where my family was waiting for me. And that's my story in a nutshell. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Matt, for sharing your story. So I'd like to open maybe for questions to the room. So if you have any questions, please state the name of your media and your name and ask your question. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Can you please, Abdulaziz Al Khamis, Sky News, can you give us more details about your case against the Qatarian bank and why you have this case and what's the details of it, how they support al-Nusra, and what you think you will win it, or you have a difficulty to win it. Thank you.
Yes, I'm very confident. Thank you. Yes, I'm very confident that I'm going to win. I have a very, very talented team of attorneys who have worked very hard for me. And the details are basically in the documentation and the records and the statements that have been made that are basically indisputable. When you have high-level government officials admitting that this charity that the bank gave an account to was shut down for financing terrorism, that it was allowed to be open for over a year. When you examine the bank's history and links to extremists like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who was at a very high-level position within the bank, he was the chairman of their Sharia advisory board. And this guy has endorsed suicide bombings in Israel, has praised Hitler for putting the Jews in their places. He has encouraged attacks and abductions of Americans. And today, he currently chairs the, I believe it's called the Unity of Good. It's a Hamas-founded organization that funnels money to them through charitable organizations. So there's a trend here. And anyone who examines this evidence, it's indisputable. I mean, obviously there are allegations now, but evidence, documentation, it doesn't lie. So I hope that answers your question. Yes, sir.
Sinon, il faut venir à la suite devant.
I can hear you.
Do you know who is the shareholder of the Qatari bank?
Who's the largest share? Who's the shareholders? There are a lot of shareholders. The largest shareholder is their sovereign wealth fund, which is the government. So they own 16% of the bank, and the rest is divided up. I'm not really sure who the other shareholders are, but I know that they are the majority shareholders.
Where they are located?
Where are they located? In Qatar, I would assume. Yes. I believe. Makes sense that their sovereign wealth fund would be. Well, you're asking me where the Qatar's sovereign wealth fund is? I would guess that it's in their own country. Thanks. Yes.
Yes.
Au micro, comme ça c'est enregistré. Merci.
My English is poor and my hearing is bad, so I will re-listen to your statements online later. But still, I understand you are suing that bank not for money. What is your real aim and expectation in suing that bank? Why do you think it is a good idea among the many bodies and people you could sue to sue the bank?
Good question. Thank you. Well, I hope that what this case accomplishes is putting banks and financial institutions on notice that if you finance these groups, you will be held accountable. That not everyone is always going to turn a blind eye, especially the American justice system. I just think of how paralyzed they would have been, the people who held me, without this financial help. And if we can basically cut off the head of the snake, which is funding, that's how I think you can really have the biggest impact on fighting the war on terror. Ideology will get you so far. If you don't have money, you can't really pursue your goals. So I hope that answers your question. Go ahead.
By the way, I didn't identify myself. Boris Engelson, a local freelancer. My second question is a famous French historian or sociologist, Alexis de Tocqueville, said that the most dangerous, difficult time for a regime is when it tries to improve. And in the case of Qatar, you show us that they have a dark side, which does not mean that everything from Qatar is for the evil. So how do you interpret? Do you mean that the whole state of Qatar, the whole royal family, etc., is indeed supporters of jihadists, terrorists, torturers, or do you think that they are still a bit schizophrenic? By the way, in Saudi Arabia, the whole family was not necessarily on the same wavelength as Osama bin Laden. So how do you interpret the situation of Qatar, which sometimes gives good signs in our sense and sometimes bad signs?
Naturally, I have my opinions on this, but I have a concern about sharing them in this type of platform because I don't want them to be misconstrued or taken out of context by their lawyers. Specifically, I'm really only prepared to talk about the Qatar Islamic Bank, not the government at all. The only thing I'll say is that 1/3 of the bank's board of directors are members of the royal family. So you can interpret that how you want. But as far as the government and their actions, I really have no comment on that at this time.
Thank you. I would have a question also to understand a bit how you come back from this trip to Syria to Syria to survive to this what you suffered there. What happened between the time you came back from Syria and today?
I can write a volume of books on that, but it's been a slow transition. The first year I spent writing my book, The Dawn Prayer, which I'm very proud of, and hope one day will be translated into Arabic because I think the Arab world would really enjoy the book. And after that, I really dedicated myself to speaking a lot to the military. But also colleges and religious groups, and sharing my experience in different contexts, and basically focusing on the good as well as the bad, the things that I learned from being locked up in a terrorist prison with other cultures and other people, and that's really what I've been doing mostly. So hope that answers your question.
And in order to put up all this case, you said you had a great team of lawyers. Who is supporting you in logistics and financially? Who is supporting you to bring this case? Because I think it's not. You should have a great team to go against a state bank.
Right. It's an expensive endeavor, and my legal team they're not charging me, so they only get paid if they win. Could never afford this on my own, which is why I feel so fortunate and privileged to have support of such talented people and intelligent people who I can have do have the utmost confidence in.
What are the odds you win this case?
I've really never done the math on that. I'm confident. They're confident. Right is on our side, so it's up to the judge from there.
Encore une question?
Maybe I didn't hear correctly your talk, but why indeed these guys didn't kill you straight away? Did they really want to emulate what happened in Guantanamo as similarly as possible?
Well, the reason why they didn't kill us right away is they were looking for a ransom. And they got it. Not from me, but from my cellmate. After I came home, about a year later, James Foley was unfortunately murdered, as we all saw online. And 5 days later, my cellmate was released in a deal negotiated by Qatar. Originally, it was said that they did this on a humanitarian basis. Nobody really believed it, and my cellmate, or former cellmate, has gone online, has gone on the record saying that yes, a ransom was paid for his release. He never said how much, but he did confirm that. So it's pretty obvious that that's what they were looking for.
And the evocation of Guantanamo, was it just rhetorics, or you think that in their rational it plays a role? They say we do to Americans what these dirty... yeah, okay.
I mean, I think Guantanamo definitely gave them ideas. They didn't think of the orange jumpsuit all by themselves. But if Guantanamo never existed, I doubt that we would have gotten 4-star treatment. We still would have been abused. It's just, it's an excuse, not a reason.
So again, thank you very much for sharing your story here.
Thank you for having me.
You have your book, Dawn, The Dawn Prayer, who is explaining how you survived in this terrorist prison, and we'll follow the outcome of this case and see what happens next. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. C'est fini.
Thank you.
Après, on continue, Boris.
I'll answer it.
Okay.
Few attendance.
Huh?
There is little attendance. Were you expecting more?
I never expect anything anymore. I get what I can